Before you retired?
I worked for many years in crime laboratories. I started out in my hometown of Evansville, Indiana, in 1974. And then in 1981, I moved to the state of Florida and began work with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And I've worked basically as a forensic scientist all of my adult career.
What's your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science, majoring in life science or biology from Indiana State University.
All right, and then what sorts of different disciplines have you worked in the various crime labs that you've worked in?
I've worked in basically in drug chemistry, in crime scene, and in gunshot residue analysis.
All right, let's talk about that last one. When did you begin working in gunshot residue analysis? And from now on, can we just say GSR?
Yes, sir. I actually began work in it back in the 80s. We did it by a different method back in the 80s. It was called atomic absorption analysis. And then as the years went by, we developed other techniques for doing gunshot residue. And in the year 2001, I trained in our new technique, and that's using a scanning electron microscope to analyze for gunshot residue particles.
All right, well, let's talk about your background and training in that specific field of gunshot residue GSR analysis. What's your specialized, if any, training and experience in that area leading up to when we transitioned into this new way of doing it with the electron microscope?
Would you repeat that question?
Yeah, you got your bachelor's degree, and what's your education, training, and background, and specifically in the area of gunshot residue analysis?
Including the old method?
Sure, briefly.
Excuse me. Well, the old method, again, was we were looking to determine quantitatively levels of barium and antimony. Then we switched over to the new technique using the scanning electron microscope. I trained in that area in the year 2001. And my training program lasted, I think, around 6 months, 8 months. And then I basically was, my expertise was reviewed by a peer group, and it was determined that I was qualified in gunshot residue analysis using the new technique, and that's using the scanning electron microscope. And I began working cases in the new technique using the scanning electron microscope in October of 2001.
Now, prior to doing any casework in this case, late 2009, early 2010, approximately how many times using the electron microscope had you done GSR analysis?
Over the years, hundreds and thousands of cases were worked using the new technique.
How many times have you given testimony in the area of gunshot residue analysis?
Over the years, over 400 times.
Have you ever not been allowed to give opinion testimony in this area?
No, sir, I don't believe I have.
Okay. All right, so let's start from the beginning. What is gunshot residue, or GSR?
Well, again, gunshot residue is the residue that is discharged from a firearm when you fire a firearm. And it's produced by the following mechanism, you might say, is that the hammer of a firearm strikes the firing pin of a cartridge case. The firing pin's filled explosive salts. And these explosive salts generally contain barium, antimony, and lead. And when that firing pin strikes the primer cup, again, that causes an explosion, which then catches the gunpowder on fire and causes another explosion. And that then forces the projectile out of a cartridge case down through the barrel of a firearm to the projectile's target. And this gunshot residue is produced mainly from the primer material of a cartridge case. And it's mainly going in the direction of the projectile, but it also can come out around the cylinder of a revolver or out of the ejection port of a semi-automatic handgun.
All right. And once it is ejected either out of the ejection port of a semi or the cylinder area of a revolver or the barrel of any type of firearm, does the force of gravity affect it? Does it pull it down to the ground eventually?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any idea how far forward gunshot residue can go if there's nothing in its way?
Well, studies have shown that it can travel 10, 15 feet.
Okay. And is this separate and apart from unburnt or partially burnt gunpowder, which we've already, and other witnesses talked about as forming stippling on things that it might strike?
Yes. Partially burned gunpowder is also a type of gunshot residue, but it's mainly organic. And again, it comes from the gunpowder itself. And it's usually nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin and or just nitrocellulose.
All right, now you mentioned salts, and then you mentioned the elements barium, antimony, and lead. To me, my distant background in chemistry implies with salt that they might be connected or bonded to something else to form a salt. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, again, in gunshot residue, in the primer material, the primer material is made up of explosive salts. And so these are salts of barium, antimony, and lead that are explosive.
Okay. And the directionality of the gunshot residue or the GSR that comes out of the barrel of the gun, is there any way to describe that? With the unspent gunpowder, it was described as like a waffle, a cone that would, expand in diameter the further away it went. Is that the same phenomenon with GSR, or is GSR different?
GSR, it's a similar type of situation, really. The gunshot residue that's coming from barium, antimony, and lead is also going to follow kind of a cone-shaped pattern in the direction of the projectile.
Now, what about the pattern that comes from the cylinder area of the firearm? Because we're talking about a revolver, so we don't need to talk about ejection ports. What directionality, if any, can be said about that?
Well, it is going to basically form a cloud that is around the cylinder of the firearm, and it can be found in 2 or 3 feet to the left, 2 or 3 feet to the right of the actual cylinder of the firearm.
How about backward?
It can be found, a couple of feet backwards too.
All right, so is it safe to say that it could form like a circle of 4 to 6 feet in diameter if you're saying 2 to 3 feet in each direction?
It's possible.
Okay. Now, what are you looking for? Well, first of all, tell us what an electron microscope is.
An electron microscope is a very powerful microscope. It allows you to see things in the micron size range. And just to give you an idea of, what a micron size is like bacteria are in the micron size range. You can't see bacteria with a naked eye. You have to have a powerful microscope to see the bacteria. The same is true with gunshot residue. Our scanning electron microscopes were computer-controlled instruments that basically allowed us to analyze whatever our sample was. We'd put it on the stage of the microscope, and under computer conditions, it would analyze the surface of whatever our sample was. And usually our samples were adhesive coated discs. And they would sample the adhesive coated disc, and because it's computer controlled, it would tell us where potential gunshot residue particles were.
What makes a particle a potential gunshot residue particle?
Well, first of all, it has to be, it's the criteria of the program set up so that it's going to identify, first of all, metals that have a high atomic weight, such as lead, such as barium, and such as antimony. It's going to find other things too, but it's mainly set up to find rather heavy elements, rather heavy metals. And once it finds one of these heavy elements or heavy metals in a particle, what it'll do is it'll flag that those elements, and it'll produce a list so that you can then go back and confirm if any of them are, if any or none are gunshot residue. And it will actually even give you a list of potential particles that are barium, antimony, and lead. And what really my job is to, after the computer-controlled run was finished, is I would go back and I would manually confirm all the particles that were gunshot residue. And the instrument would analyze for a particle, and maybe it would find thousands of particles on a sample disk. And it would analyze each particle in about 4 seconds. But that's not long enough for you to get a real good X-ray analysis of a particle in just 4 seconds. So what my real job is to go back after the computer-controlled analysis and do a long computer analysis, a long X-ray analysis of those particles. And usually it would take about a minute or two to get a very nice X-ray analysis.
Is there a way to tell the instrument, what's your atomic weight cutoff? How light do you want to go?
Well, again, the instrument's going to see all kinds of elements, but it's only going to indicate to us, to the analyzer, it's only going to indicate particles that are potential gunshot residue particles.
Okay.
And those are particles that, again, contain barium, antimony, and lead.
Now, you said that generally it's an adhesive tab that it will analyze?
Yes, it's the surface of the adhesive tape.
All right. And does it analyze the entire tape or just a portion of it?
Well, we try to get it to analyze the whole surface of the tape. Sometimes there's so many particles on a sample stub that it only analyzes, maybe half or 3/4 of the sample before it moves on to the next sample. And we had a cutoff of 5 hours from the time that the analysis began, the computer analysis. From the time the computer analysis began to the time that we concluded that analysis, the criteria was 5 hours. And sometimes, again, it would only get through 3/4 of a sample stub before it moved on to the next sample stub.
Okay. And going back to GSR, can it be transferred once it lands on a surface or a person? Can it then be later transferred?
Yes.
And were you asked to analyze any gunshot residue kits in this particular case?
Yes.
Right. May I approach with 11 and 37?
You may.
I'm going to ask you to examine 11 and let me know if you recognize it as anything.
Yes, this is the gunshot residue kit that I analyzed. It's marked with the FDLE barcode label. It's marked with the Orange County Sheriff's Department identifier information. And it has the owner's name as James Ward.
Okay. And what was inside that envelope when you analyzed it back then?
I believe that there were there's 2 sample devices or 2 sample stubs in this gunshot residue kit.
And were they internally labeled in any way?
They should be in a gunshot residue evidence envelope.
Okay. I mean,
And they should be labeled also as to both each sample stub should be labeled. One should be labeled right hand and the other one should be labeled left hand.
okay. And now you mentioned it, but I wasn't sure we clearly mentioned it earlier. When you were doing this work with the electron microscope from 2001 on, was that for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes.
All right. And did you analyze these 2, well, let me back it up. Inside those were those adhesive tapes that we were talking about?
Yes.
Did you analyze both of them with the electron microscope as you just described, the computer doing its part and then you doing the follow-up work?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about the one that was said to come from the right hand. What were the results?
There were no gunshot residue particles identified from the right hand.
And do you also annotate particles that could be related to gunshot residue, but you can't call them gunshot residue?
Well, we may, again, they're particles that are in the list, but they're not completely analyzed. In other words, I don't spend, a minute or 2 dwelling on a particle that I don't think is gunshot residue.
And what makes a particle uniquely gunshot residue as opposed to any other particle in our world?
A gunshot residue particle is a particle that's going to contain barium, antimony, and lead. We're certainly going to find particles that contain lead. Lead is pretty ubiquitous in our environment, and it doesn't even have to be gunshot residue. It could be from many, many other sources where you're going to find lead and lead contamination. Barium can also be found in our environment from a number of sources. The rarest of those 3 elements is antimony. And even if we find particles of antimony without lead and without barium, then we're not going to call it gunshot residue. It could certainly be gunshot residue, but we're not going to identify it, and we're not going to write a report up that says we found gunshot residue when all we found was particles that contain antimony.
Is there any sort of guideline as to how far in time from behind an event where a gun was discharged allegedly or supposedly in the presence of a person before the gunshot residue test should have been done?
Yes, on someone who's a live subject, we basically always insisted that the analysis be done, that the collection be done within 8 hours. And the reason for that is if someone is alive, then they're going to be using their hands. And either knowingly or unknowingly, even if they have gunshot residue on their hands, they're knowingly or unknowingly going to be moving that gunshot residue by using their hands. Wiping your hands off on your pants, sticking your hands in your pocket. You know, certainly if you wash your hands, we don't expect to find gunshot residue. But everything that you do with your hands can either reduce or eliminate the gunshot residue that could be found. And after about 8 hours, we don't expect to find it on a live subject. Now, if someone has died...
we'll get to that.
Okay.
Let me stop you there. Here's my next question. If a live person who's doing ordinary, normal things with his hands for 3 hours has no gunshot residue, does that allow you to conclude that they were not present within this area where gunshot residue could have been deposited from a gunshot going off 3 hours earlier?
No.
And why is that?
Again, a person who tests negative, they could have washed their hands, and within 15 minutes of firing a firearm, you could have washed your hands, and you're going to test negative.
How about just from normal usage without washing your hands over the course of 3 hours for a live person that may have in fact been present for a gunshot residue event? Can they test positive or still test negative even though they may have been present for an event 3 hours earlier?
Yes, they could test negative.
Okay. And is that for the reasons you outlined earlier about pockets and everything else?
Yes.
And did you also test what was said to be from the left hand of Mr. Ward?
Yes.
And what was the results?
Again, gunshot residue was not identified.
Okay. And again, if Mr. Ward's left hand hypothetically was present for a gunshot residue event 3 hours earlier, does that mean, does that result that there's no gunshot residue 3 hours later indicate that he was not present for a gunshot residue event?
No.
Same reasons, pockets, ordinary usage, nothing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, did you also analyze State's Exhibit 37?
Yes, sir.
And to shorten this, was this identified to you to be gunshot residue collection kit from Mrs. Ward?
Yes.
And was it 2 of those adhesive tapes labeled right and left?
I believe that it was.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you analyze each of them in the same method with your electron microscope, searching out for particles, and then you doing follow-up work on particles you found to be interesting based on the computer results?
Yes.
What were the results for the right hand?
For the right hand, no gunshot residue particles were identified.
And what about the left hand?
For the left hand, one gunshot residue particle from the left hand was identified.
And was there a cutoff back then for calling something trace gunshot residue versus being gunshot residue?
Yes.
What was that cutoff point?
If we find 3 or less particles, like 1, 2, or 3, then we consider that a trace amount of gunshot residue that was identified. If we find 4 or more particles, then basically we write up a report that says gunshot residue was identified.
Okay. So let me ask you a hypothetical. If Mrs. Ward was shot in the face with a firearm, does the no gunshot residue being found on her right hand indicate that she was not present for a gunshot residue event?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what the basis of the objection is.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
I didn't hear what the basis of your objection is.
I object because it's asking for his expert opinion about the facts of the case in terms of the scene, so I object.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Do you remember my question, or would you like me to repeat it?
Please repeat it.
So hypothetically, if Mrs. Ward is shot in the face with a firearm within a couple of feet, but her right hand doesn't have any gunshot residue on it, does that mean that she was not present for a gunshot residue event?
No, it doesn't mean that she wasn't present.
Okay. Can one be present for a gunshot residue event, as you described, outside of the barrel and outside of the cylinder in a 2 to 3 foot circle radius? Can one be present and not have gunshot residue deposited on her right hand?
Yes.
And that doesn't in any way mean Mrs. Ward wasn't present when she was shot.
That is correct.
All right.
I'll allow that one. Go ahead.
Left hand, same question. Anything that you can conclude from one gunshot residue particle being on her left hand as to whether or not she was present or not present for a gunshot residue event?
It's, again, possible that she had one particle on her hand from being in a gunshot residue event.
All right. And is it also possible that there was another explanation for that one particle, since it doesn't meet your cutoff of 4?
Well, there are other reasons for a person coming up with a small amount.
And what would those reasons be?
And some of those reasons are that you just didn't produce enough gunshot residue to have more than 4 particles on a person's hands. And that can be just because the amount of gunshot residue was limited in the first place.
Okay.
And, you know, as an example, let's say that somebody was shot, and let's say that their hands were at their side at the time, then it would be less likely to have gunshot residue if your hands are at your side. Now, if your hands are in a defensive posture, then you may have gunshot residue on your hands.
Okay. All right. And have you ever had the opportunity to do gunshot residue analysis of hands from somebody who was known to have committed suicide? A scene where there's only one person involved and there was a suicide involved. Have you ever done that?
Pardon me, Your Honor, we object. I'd like to approach the sidebar.
All right. You may proceed.
Would you like me to repeat my question?
Yes, please.
All right. Have you ever had the opportunity to examine GSR tests done on someone who had clearly been involved in a firearm event, perhaps killing him or herself, had his or her hands bagged up, and then not had the GSR testing done until after transport to the morgue, and then had it done at the morgue?
Yes.
Are you able to recover GSR?
Usually we would, yes.
Now, have you, and did you say thousands of times you've done this, electron microscope analysis?
Yes.
Have you ever analyzed adhesive tape that was blotted over the inside of transport bags on a corpse's hand?
No.
So I take it then that's not something that was normally and routinely done in the practice of gunshot residue analysis.
That is correct.
All right. May I approach?
You may.
Showing you 14 in evidence and then 15. If you could look at them both, that would be great.
Yes,
Do
sir.
you recognize 14 and 15?
Yes.
Okay. And what do you recognize them as?
These were gunshot residue kits that were submitted to the laboratory. Again, I know that because it has the FDLE barcode label on it. And that's true of both of these envelopes. And the gunshot residue kits inside of these envelopes were analyzed.
Okay. All right, and State's Exhibit 14, was that representative of having come from Yesenia Barron's hands after washing them before test firing a firearm?
Yes.
And did you analyze them in a manner that we've talked about earlier with your electron microscope plus personal follow-up work?
Yes.
Did you locate any GSR particles?
No particles were found on the samples before the samples that were marked as prior to firing.
Okay. How about after in 15? And again, let me back that up. Inside 14, was there two of them, left and right labeled?
Yes.
And in 15, were there two of them, left and right labeled?
Yes.
Did you analyze, what were the results of the analysis of the post-fire State's Exhibit 15 for the right hand?
Just a minute.
Yes, sir.
You may. Proceed.
What were the results when you analyzed the adhesive tape said to be from the right hand post-firing when you did the electron microscope and your personal follow-up work?
Gunshot residue was identified.
How many particles?
And altogether, from the right hand sample, 26 gunshot residue particles were identified.
And on the left hand?
On the left hand, 9 particles were identified.
So can we conclude from this that this particular firearm with that particular round of ammunition does create GSR?
Yes.
And is it true that sometimes there's ammunition that does not have primer that has GSR?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, turning back to Mrs. Ward, with those results, if her hands were on the firearm at the time of its discharge, would you expect to see more results than what you found?
I'm going to sustain that. Rephrase the question or lay a foundation.
All right. Have you ever done GSR analysis on a corpse's hand after it had been transported to the morgue and the GSR testing done there? I believe I asked this earlier.
Yes.
From a known firearm event, perhaps, you know, the one person in the room and a firearm laying next to his or her person. Those types of situations.
Yes.
Okay. And you've analyzed Mrs. Ward's gunshot residue results, correct?
Yes.
And when somebody has passed away, obviously they're not putting their hands in their pockets, correct?
That's correct.
Or rubbing them or doing any of our normal day-to-day activities.
There can be movement of someone who's deceased, for example, in the body bag and things like that.
Yes, but have you still, as you testified earlier, found gunshot residue results on hands that have been bagged and transported before being analyzed?
Yes.
Okay. So do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mrs. Ward's results are consistent with her hands being on the firearm at the time it was discharged into her?
Overruled.
From finding one particle, I basically can't conclude that she handled or fired a firearm.
What's your opinion?
From finding one particle, there's lots of different reasons that a person could come up with one particle. And it's not just from handling or firing a firearm.
Okay. That leads me into my next few questions. Is GSR that comes out of the front of the barrel of the gun in any way different than the GSR that comes out in the radial pattern from the cylinder in that 2 to 3 foot radius that you testified about?
Well, looking at it under the scanning electron microscope, it all appears to be the same thing, particles that contain barium, antimony, and lead. So no, I cannot conclude whether it's coming out following the projectile or whether it's coming out around the cylinder of a firearm.
So if we back this up all the way, if somebody has gunshot residue on his or her hands in the areas that they test it, all that can tell us is one of a few things. And let me know if you disagree. One, they could have been in that cone of projection in front of the barrel up to, I believe you said 10 or 15 feet.
Yes.
Another possible reason for anybody to have gunshot residue on his or her hands would be being within this 4 to 6 foot diameter circle around a firearm event.
Yes.
Or ultimately, they could have picked up a gun and not discharged it, but the gun already had GSR deposited on it from being shot before.
Correct.
Or they could have touched somebody or something else that had GSR particles on it already.
Yes.
And then as we went over earlier, like in Mr. Ward's instance, not having gunshot residue on you several hours after the discharge of a firearm doesn't mean you can conclude that that person wasn't within that 2 to 3 foot radius or 4 to 6 foot diameter area where gunshot residue could be deposited.
That's correct.
Does the Florida Department of Law Enforcement even do gunshot residue testing anymore?
No, sir.
Why not?
Well, they continued to do it until the day that I retired, but when I retired, they retired the service. And basically, gunshot residue, as we practiced it, the science was excellent. It's the interpretation of the results that, where there's a lot of arguments on different sides of what a positive means or what a negative means or what a trace means. Again, it's not that we have found gunshot residue or we haven't found gunshot residue. The instrument and the science is excellent for that. It's the interpretation of the science, because what someone would like for us to say is, did this person fire a firearm? And we're not always able to say that. We can say that they were possibly fired the firearm. We can say that they possibly handled a firearm. But we're not. I do not get on the stand and say that someone has fired a firearm.
And in fact, is it possible that somebody can even say that they shot someone and then not have gunshot residue particles present on them 3 hours later?
Yes.
And is it possible to actually be at a firearm discharge event, such as Mrs. Ward, and then not have particles on one hand and have only one on her other?
Yes.
No other questions?
Cross.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hope you're enjoying your retirement.
Well, I'm doing pretty good except for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And, you know, again, you've heard me cough. I'm just getting over the flu, so stay away from me.
Well, didn't realize that you were a potential flu carrier.
Yeah,
I'll stay
keep
at
your
the podium.
distance. This
I do
poor
have
girl.
I do have a few questions for you. Let's agree on one thing. You've given very detailed testimony. Can we agree that there was no gunshot residue particles found at all on Bob Ward's hands, either his left hand or his right hand?
Yes.
Can we agree that the only gunshot particle found at all in this case, vis-a-vis Mr. Ward or Mrs. Ward, was found on Mrs. Ward's left hand, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you get the test, what happens is that you indicated that there would be two swabs or cleaning or excuse me, the disc, one for the right hand, one for the left hand, correct?
Yes.
Now, how do you tell whether the particles or particle are found on the front or the back of the hand or the palm of the hand?
When you have a two-stub kit, you don't know that. You just know that it could be from the palm or it could be from the back of the hand.
But before, during your tenure as a gunshot expert, there used to be a four-part kit that would do the back of the hand and then the palm on the left hand, correct?
Yes.
And then the palm of the hand on the right hand and the back of the hand on the right hand, correct?
Yes.
That way, when you did your analysis, if gunshot residue was found, then you'd be able to tell whether it was on the palm or on the back of the hand.
Well, not necessarily, because, and that's one of the reasons that we eliminated the four-stub kits, is live subjects, they're going to have the opportunity to redistribute that gunshot residue. Let's say you do have it just on your right palm. And then you put your right palm into your left hand, and guess what? You've just got gunshot residue on your left back of your hand. And it was originally on your right palm, but now it's on your left back, and you redistributed it. And so because of that, we basically went to a simpler kit, and we don't try to say that this is more indicative of coming from the palm area than the back of the hand. We just say this sample came from the right hand, this sample came from the left hand.
Well, let's follow through on that. Specifically in this case, you were doing gunshot residue on Mrs. Ward, correct?
Yes.
And so the issue of whether or not Mrs. Ward would be rubbing her hands, that didn't apply in this case, did it?
Possibly not.
So if you had a couple of kits there, and you have someone who's not going to be rubbing her hands, then you could have done tests, yes or no, could have done tests on the back of the hand and on the palm. Isn't that right?
Well, again, we eliminated those kits back around 2006, best I recall.
But if you have two kits, then you can use two kits to do the back and the palm, yes or no?
It's possible, yes.
Okay. Now, you indicated that that this gunshot residue, which comes from the primer, right?
Yes.
Can project out 10 to 15 feet, correct?
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, when it projects out, then you can actually have gunshot residue on a wall, correct?
It's possible.
And you can actually test if the wall is dabbed like you would dab someone's hands, then you could test to find out whether gunshot residue was on the wall, couldn't you?
I have never had a sample come into the laboratory that was from a wall.
But you could test it, couldn't you?
It's possible.
Okay.
Anything's possible.
As a matter of fact, if gunshot residue were on the wall, then it would actually be prone to be there longer than if it were on someone's hands. Isn't that right?
That's possible too.
Okay. So in this case, did the state send to you any gunshot residue samples that they had taken off the walls in the bedroom there in the ward bedroom?
No, I've never had a sample from a wall sent in for gunshot residue analysis.
So you didn't get one in this case, correct?
No.
Okay. And I believe that, do you believe that the gunshot residue on a wall could stay there for days, if not weeks?
Yes, it could.
Okay. After you run your test on the gunshot residue, do you do any other, after the computer does its printout, do you do any other additional test on the particles to determine whether or not you conclude that the computer is correct or not?
As I testified earlier, is I do a long analysis of particles that are flagged as potential gunshot residue particles. And instead of doing an X-ray analysis that is about 4 seconds under the computer-controlled program, is that I will actually do an X-ray analysis that takes 1 to 3 minutes. And I will collect a spectra of whatever's there. And again, for me to call it gunshot residue, it has to be, I have to be able to identify, using the X-ray analyzer, barium, antimony, and lead. And that procedure, which is a manual procedure, takes about anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes.
Okay. So just to be clear, unless you have those 3 elements together in the particle, we don't have gunshot residue, right?
Well, it could be gunshot residue, but it could be many other things. And so we're not going to call it gunshot residue.
You would not call it gunshot residue unless it has all 3 of the elements, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Because as you indicated, in our environment, there could be in the environment, people could have lead on their hands, possibly barium and possibly even some antimony, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you were running the test to determine with the agent who washed her hands, that was done instantly. The firing was done instantly after she washed her hands. Is that right?
I believe so.
And then instantly after that, the gunshot residue test was administered?
Again, I don't recall being present when that was done. I believe our firearms examiner was present, but I don't recall being present.
And the sole purpose of that test was to determine, and only to determine, whether that particular gun, in this case, we have a gun which is states 20, whether that particular gun creates or emits gunshot residue, correct?
Yes.
Now, you were asked questions about whether or not, whether you had run gunshot residue tests on cases involving suicide, correct?
Yes.
Mr. J asked you that.
Yes.
Now, that would be a situation where an individual is alone or either law enforcement or the evidence would show that that individual had, in essence, shot him or herself, correct? Thus the suicide, right?
Yes.
Now, so that would be a situation where there would be no struggle with someone else. It would be an individual taking his or her own life, correct?
Yes.
Now, in that situation, with no movement or no activity or no struggle, then you would expect to have more gunshot residue found on the hands of the suicide victim, correct?
It's possible.
But in some cases, what you did is you actually went and you took gunshot residue on the hands of suicide victims, correct?
Yes.
Now, you were asked whether or not you found gunshot residue on those hands, and I believe that you indicated that usually we would. Do you remember that testimony a few minutes ago?
Yes.
When you say usually we would, may I then conclude that there were occasions, even in single-person suicides, in which you did not find gunshot residue on the hands of the suicide victim?
Yes, that has occurred.
You were asked a question by Mr. J about whether or not the particle on Mrs. Ward's hands, whether you could conclude whether she fired a gun. Do you remember that?
Would you repeat that, please?
You were asked a question by Mr. J about, given the one particle of GSR on Mrs. Ward's hands, whether you could conclude that she fired the gun, correct?
Yes.
Now, you weren't obviously there, right?
No, I was not.
And you cannot conclude or reach any conclusion one way or the other from your analysis of what happened in the Ward bedroom that night, can you?
No, there's a lot of possibilities for coming up with a trace amount of gunshot residue.
And so you simply cannot conclude you cannot based upon your studies, correct?
That is correct.
Now, when we talk about you ask questions about bagging the hands, correct?
Yes.
And the reason why the hands are bagged is so that whatever evidence might be on the hands could be then preserved and kept inside the bags as the body is moved, correct?
Yes.
And so if a body's hands are bagged and the body is being carried on a gurney and downstairs and in a van or whatever the vehicle would be, all of that would have an impact on whether or not there could be any jostling of any gunshot residue on the hands of the individual with the bagged hands, correct?
Yes.
And so when you get to when the individual gets to the morgue, they are placed in cold storage, correct?
Yes.
Now, what is your analysis of what can happen vis-a-vis the gunshot residue testing from someone who is taken out of a cooling area of 45 degrees and then had gunshot residue testing done at that time?
We can still find gunshot residue under those situations and those conditions, but again, there's some times when we don't.
Now, because when we're taking a body out of the cooling area and you're placing that body, then there's going to be some condensation from the warmer room on the cooler body. Is that right?
That's possible, yes.
And so unless the hands and the body are dried and that condensation is allowed to dry, then your ability to get GSR off a body in which there might be condensation is lessened, isn't it?
It could be.
And the reason why it's lessened is that when you have the adhesive disc there, it's harder if there's moisture or condensation on the hand to make sure that you're getting all the GSR that might be there, correct?
That is very possible.
Now, GSR can, as you've described it, go up to 10 to 15 feet, correct?
Yes.
And it can be, GSR can be collected or retrieved from clothing, can it?
It's possible.
And GSR can be retrieved from curtains, can it?
From what?
Curtains?
It's possible.
Well, so in this case, what GSR testing did the government ask you to do on the clothing of Mrs. Ward?
I don't believe they asked me to do any testing on the clothing. It's our general policy not to analyze clothing.
But if you're asked to by the investigative agents, then you'll do it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as it relates to Mr. Ward, tell us what GSR testing you did on the clothing of Mr. Ward.
Again, I don't recall that there was any clothing submitted.
Okay. And again, the question would be, if the government had asked you to conduct GSR testing on the clothing of Mr. Ward, then you would have done it, wouldn't you?
It's possible.
Now, you had indicated a couple of times that when you were asked by Mr. J about 3 hours later whether or not someone could have no GSR on their hands but still have been in a GSR event. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you're not suggesting to this jury that you have any evidence whatsoever to show that Mr. Ward washed his hands, do you?
No, I don't know that information.
As a matter of fact, when the GSR testing was done on Mr. Ward's hands, there were elements on his hands, not GSR particles, but there were elements on his hands of silica that would indicate dirt, correct?
I don't recall.
You don't recall?
No.
Do you need to check your notes?
There were all kinds of particles found on his hands.
All kinds of particles.
There was bismuth sulfate. There was iron-rich particles. There were miscellaneous salts. There wasn't really that much silicates, though.
But there were silicates there. That's kind of what comes from, I guess, dirt.
There was like 4 particles. And
Soil.
some of the other areas, like iron, there were 700 particles.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you talked about is this bagging of the hands. I want to get back to that if we can. Now, when the body goes to the morgue, the hands have been bagged, and ultimately the bags are cut off the hands, correct?
Yes.
Now, did you run any tests for GSR on the bags, the insides of the bags that contain Mrs. Ward's hands?
I have never analyzed bags that were bags for persons' hands. I've never analyzed them for gunshot residue, and that includes this case.
But will you admit that you can test the bags? The bags can be tested, can't they?
Yes, it's possible.
So even though the bags can be tested, no one asked you and you didn't do it, right?
That is correct.
And even though the clothing can be tested, you didn't do it because no one asked you, correct?
That is correct.
And even though you could test for GSR on the walls, you didn't do it because no one asked you, correct?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Redirect.
I just want to make sure we all understand what you're saying. The advancement of gunshot residue analysis as a forensic discipline has advanced from 4 adhesive tapes to 2 adhesive tapes to not doing it at all, correct?
That's correct.
No other questions?
May this witness be excused. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Gillen? All right. Thank you, sir. You're free to go. State, you have any other witnesses you've been called today?
The ones remaining are Monday morning, Judge.
All right. Because we need to end early today, we don't have a witness that we can stop by 4, so I'm not going to start them. So you have to try and remember what they said on Monday. So you're going to get a very early Friday. I see no protest from the jury. All right. You all have a wonderful weekend. Remember the rules, and I will see you on Monday morning. We will start at 9 a.m., meet the deputies in the jury room at 8:45. Thank you. See, I'm standing because I'm tired of sitting. Y'all welcome to sit if you'd like. Anything else we need to address this afternoon?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. J, what you filed is still not showing up in the court file.
Isn't that usual?
I'm shocked by that. Can you just email it to me, please?
And
copy, of course, the defense.
yes. It's brilliantly written, you know, a solid like 3/4 of a page. So.
I look forward to every word.
Oh, so you've already gotten it? Yeah, so they got the e-service, but I'm sure somebody is busy downstairs reading it and spell checking it. And
Yeah, that's what's happening. But, you know, since I don't want to stress them out, just email it to me.
Yes, ma'am.
If y'all will email yours. And are you expecting to rest on Monday? Do you know?
I'm hoping to get a lot of rest this weekend, and I am resting after those 3 witnesses.
Okay. Which will take
And I've
all of
informed
Monday.
them. They've been made aware.
That's what I'm about to tell you. It goes the other way. You need to tell him who you're calling on Monday. So I'm guessing Dr. Stefani is going to take most of the morning. You don't know. All right. How long do you all think you have in terms of days of witnesses? This is all a wild guess, I know.
If we started Monday afternoon, I would expect that we would rest on Wednesday.
How much time does the state at this point think they need for closing? It was
Probably.
an hour for opening?
Was it?
Well,
I'm very sorry.
50 minutes, yeah, 50 minutes. Yeah. Between the two of you, it was a little over 2 hours for openings.
So I would imagine 60 to 75-ish, including rebuttal.
Okay, opening and rebuttal, defense.
Whatever he wants, I want to.
Well, those are the rules. You get whatever he gets, but
Yeah, 60 or 60. I think we can both do it in an hour, so I would say let's do a 60-minute shot clock.
it's a 60-minute clock with a little bit of leeway. Because you know, it's a complicated case, so I'll give you all plenty of time to do your closings. We will break in the middle to give Madam Court Reporter little fingers a rest in the middle of closings, not in the middle of your closing, but when this is done. But Madam Court Reporter is not, I'm not going to make her sit through 2 hours again. So at the end of about an hour, we'll stop and let her take a break, and then we'll do your closing after that. All right, well, I'll play it by ear depending on how the time is going. All right. All right, thank you all very much. Have a good weekend. Court is in recess until Monday morning at 9 a.m.